begin by discussing the development of a worldview. The development of a worldview. Or, to put it another way, what is philosophy all about? A lot of people are intimidated when they hear the word philosophy because, well, philosophers sometimes sound so academic and abstract that they at least like to give the impression that they're intellectual, and they use a vocabulary that can be intimidating. And so people are often put off by philosophy. In fact, if you say, now we're going to study the philosophy of this or that, most people just kind of, they click off upstairs. They say, well, that's the end of it for me. I'm not into philosophy. I'm not abstract and so forth. And as long as that is your conception of philosophy, or that's your attitude and your response to philosophy, it's doubtful that you'll be effective as a defender of the faith. Because the defense of the faith requires you to be basically a better philosopher than the unbeliever. Now, does that mean you have to stop everything, go back to school, and get a philosophy major? No, by no means. But if you don't stop to think philosophically about what's going on in the dispute between the believer and the unbeliever, I think you'll probably be swamped in the argument. Your best hope as an apologist, if you refuse to think philosophically, is to run into people who are always dumber than you. But if you'll study philosophy, you'll be able to talk to anybody, provide an answer from the faith to anybody who asks you. That doesn't mean you're going to be able to keep up with a PhD in philosophy in terms of vocabulary and all that. But if you know what the issues are and what you're looking to accomplish, all you have to do is go slow and say, please explain that to me, and you'll be able to finish the conversation and not be worried that he sandbagged you or you're not able to finally surmount what he is saying. It's very important, therefore, that we begin today by getting rid of this, if not animosity, at least our fear of philosophy. What is philosophy? Well, it may help you to know that if you ask 10 philosophers that question, you'll get 9 answers. Right? And I'm being generous. Philosophy is a very difficult thing to define. We all have some idea of who, quote, the philosophers have been in history. Everybody would say, well, Plato was a philosopher, and Kant was a philosopher, and that sort of thing. But just what it is they were doing that constitutes them philosophers is not easy to put our finger on. In my own estimation, philosophy amounts to 2 basic functions that we perform intellectually. The first is a critical function. To think philosophically is to cross-examine the most basic assumptions of our thought. Not everybody shares those same basic assumptions, at least in outward profession. And you become philosophical when you start saying, well, now, why do you believe that? And how is this conviction supported by that conviction? You start asking critical or analytical questions. That's part of the philosopher's task. But the philosopher's task is not simply to be a pain, going around asking questions that people can't answer and embarrassing them because of their contradictions. The philosopher is also called upon to provide a positive statement, but the positive statement is not about any one particular aspect of human experience. Philosophers don't tell us about medical science. Philosophers don't tell us about astronomy. Philosophers don't teach us, about geography or about math. And what is it that philosophers study? Well, the answer is everything, but nothing in particular. You know what I'm saying? The philosopher tries to give a total picture of human reality, experience, so that every aspect of our experience is integrated, has its place. And so you have the critical or analytical function of the philosopher, which is to cross-examine basic assumptions. And you have the positive, unifying construction of the philosopher, the function of attempting to develop a world view. Now, I'm going to use that expression. We'll define it in a little while. To understand where philosophy comes from, I think it'd be good to first consider the inevitable process of becoming a philosopher. The inevitable process. Now, let's go back to the beginning of my comments a few moments ago. I said many of you are intimidated, or many people anyway, are intimidated by the thought of doing philosophy. The irony about that is everybody's doing it. Everybody does philosophy. That isn't to say everybody does it well. That isn't to say everybody does it self-consciously. That isn't to say everybody does it professionally. Get paid to teach it or to argue it or whatever. It isn't to say that everybody does it with a sophisticated vocabulary. And it isn't even to say that everybody knows they're doing it. But everybody does it. Everybody engages in some measure of cross-examination of basic assumptions. And everybody has some kind of total picture where each aspect of human experience finds its proper place and is related to everything else. So everybody does philosophy. I want to argue that it is inevitable, the process of developing a philosophy. And what is not inevitable, as I said, is that you'll do it well. And that's why it's good to study philosophy, to sharpen our critical tools, to consider a wider range of options, and to come up with better answers. It's good to study philosophy, but everybody does philosophy, whether they study it self-consciously or not. Where does philosophy begin? Well, let's back up. Where does human life begin? Well, we're born. What do we know about babies?
Cute.
Well, we know a lot of things about babies. They make messes, right? They cry, they get hungry. But what do we know about the mental life of babies? Well, the first thing that we see in the development of a child, to put it very simply, is curiosity. Babies take an interest in that mobile that's, above their heads, or a sound that they hear, or maybe, the regularity of their mother's face. But children have a natural curiosity. Indeed, it's when we see children not responding to their environment in curious ways that we take them to the doctor to find out if there isn't something wrong. Maybe a hearing deficiency, or maybe brain problems, whatever it may be. But in the natural development of a human being, we all begin to be curious. And that curiosity takes us to a point where we learn that knowledge is power. I don't expect any child to sit up in the crib and say, I have discovered that knowledge is power. But looking back at, that experience, we can summarize it by saying that children very soon learn that their curiosity can be turned into something valuable. They learn, don't put this kind of thing in your mouth because it doesn't taste good. So I'm being very simple here. Have I intimidated anybody yet? Curiosity, which is natural in man, in fact, I think it's God-given. Curiosity leads us to try to learn about the world, primarily so that we can control our environment. All right? Children learn to control their environment. Some children learn to control their parents. Isn't that amazing? That babies can outwit grown adults? They can. And they learn to do that because they start seeing connections between things, like crying and getting attention. It's obvious enough, right? So they learn, don't put this in your mouth, don't touch that, this is fun, here's how to get mom's attention, things of that nature. All of us begin curious. All of us eventually realize that if we learn about the nature of things, we can better control our world. Knowledge is power. And as we mature beyond early childhood, we come to desire what might be called an expanded horizon of understanding. As I raised my own children, it was, every age has its own glory and joy, I realized, but it was so much fun to see them move from that undifferentiated interest, how do I control my environment, to just wanting to learn about things beyond, to gain a broader horizon. So what's it like when How do people live on the next block over? I mean, that's very minimal, but are people the same over there? And, they want to know more about the world. They want to expand their horizon of understanding. Dreadfully, in the public schools all across America today, I feel that one of the greatest insults and one of the greatest deprivations that are imposed on children is that desire, which is natural, to expand your horizon of understanding, is stunted. Because we don't deal with children, I think, in a proper way. We don't show them how to learn, and basically we try to put them in a straitjacket, and they don't learn because they have to do it in a way that, is along with 30 other students in a classroom. But that's for another day. I'll complain about that. The point is, children naturally want to learn. They've learned the value of knowledge. If I know the nature of something, I can control my environment. And they have this curiosity that wants to expand the horizon of their understanding. But as they grow beyond that early stage in elementary school, they start looking, and all of us should start looking, for a more systematic organization and interrelation of what we know. And now we begin to realize, well, there's a connection between what I've learned over here in the kitchen and what I'm learning here about fire. Heat and cooking food go together. So if I knew better how to produce heat and control it, children learn I could be more effective in the kitchen and maybe cook the things that I want, whatever. That is to say, we begin to realize that this world is not just a disjointed set of, a marble of knowledge here, a marble of knowledge there, that things are related to one another. And so we try to organize what we've learned. And as we organize what we learn, especially in the higher grades and as we go off to university, we engage in disciplined inquiry about a particular aspect of human experience. A disciplined inquiry. Now it's not just curiosity developing and amassing information and trying to relate it to other things, but now we're going to have a method of learning. And now we're going to organize things, and we're going to try to systematize what we learn. So what we learn about physics has a bearing on what we learn in biology, and what we learn in physics and biology has a bearing on how we understand man and man's behavior. So we now are engaged in a kind of disciplined inquiry, asking what are the appropriate methods for learning, and what are the rules by which we apply what we know. And as we ask those kinds of questions, we seek general laws that govern our phenomena. Now we want to know not just is water, something that satisfies my thirst. Is the water hot or cold? Is the water, whatever. But we ask, what is water? And when we find out that it's H2O, has 2 hydrogen molecules for every oxygen molecule, then we know something about its relationship to other things that also have hydrogen or oxygen in them, and other elements. And so general laws are developed to govern the phenomena. This is what we might call natural laws. We try to look for the laws of physics and the laws of chemistry. And these laws help us not only to explain what happens in our experience, but to predict what will happen in our experience. It gives us a measure of control over our environment. There's really a continuity between the child in the crib, you see, who's looking for control over his environment, and the scientist who's trying to control his environment by sending a rocket to the moon or whatever. The difference between the two is not one of kind. The difference is one of degree. Now, do you understand that? Anybody intimidated yet? We all know there's this natural progression from the earliest curiosity of the child to more disciplined inquiry, to the attempt to say things which are generally true and give us predictive power over our environment. But that isn't the end of our natural curiosity, because we do push beyond that and we ask other questions. Eventually we face more fundamental questions about this disciplined inquiry and the outcome of our study of the natural world and of ourselves. We ask questions about how do all these things relate to one another, and why do they relate to one another? And how do I put together what I know about my own experience and about human life with what I've learned about the natural world? That doesn't seem like a difficult question or even a particularly relevant question when you're just specifically talking about the composition of water, and, and how there's blood in your finger. I mean, that is a call for a lot of explanations. But what else do I know about myself? I know that I make decisions. Sometimes I don't live up to the commitments that I've made. Sometimes the decisions I've made conflict with other people. I know that there's this element of contingency or freedom and creativity about me, and yet I don't see that in the natural world. I see the natural world operating in a fairly uniform, predictable way. Now that naturally raises the question, am I part of the natural world, which operates in this uniform way, or is the reality that I'm in fact free and I make the decisions that I do, and I'm a creative, personal kind of entity? Now when we start asking questions like that, and by the way, many people get discouraged at this point because it's so hard, and they say, well, don't worry about it. Well, you do have to worry about it, because in the end, it makes a difference as to how you live in this world, right? Let's say that we find somebody guilty of murdering his wife. Now, should we do anything about that? Most of us would say, well, of course we need to do something about it. This person ought, notice that, ought to be punished. But in a world where there is no ought, there's just the way things happen in a predictable way, ought is really a ridiculous thing to say. And that's why many people argue we shouldn't punish criminals. We may want to reprogram them or try to, re-stimulate them so they have the right connection between this kind of behavior and rewards. But it won't do any good to punish them, because punishment only makes sense if you think there's moral culpability. Moral culpability only makes sense if you believe in human freedom. But in a world where everything is controlled by natural laws, there is no human freedom. So when we push beyond our scientific learning and start asking about how do we connect, how do we relate the various things we know about the world and about ourselves, when we start asking questions like, can we know everything there is to know by natural science? Is what we've learned in natural science reliable? Is it always going to be that way? Things like this force us to become more abstract, okay, more general than even the general laws of science. We're going to ask questions about what's real. Are quasars real? Or are they just a way of talking? Is love real? Or is that just a way of talking? We're going to ask about what's real. We're going to ask about how we know what we know. Everything that we claim to know relies in large measure on memory. What's memory? What controls memory? Is memory reliable? By the way, can you test the reliability of memory without relying on memory? No, that's one of the toughest questions in epistemology, how we can know what we know if everything we know is dependent to some degree on memory, and you can't test memory without relying on memory, then we got a real problem here, don't we? We're asking questions, more general questions than just what do we know about ourselves and about the natural world. We might ask about how we should use this information. Should I use the information I've learned about particle physics and so forth to develop a bomb that can hurt a lot of other human beings? Is it appropriate for me to go ahead and hurt those other human beings, maybe even kill them, if they don't do what I would want them to do? What if they get in the way of what I predict is the best, line of behavior for people? Should I just eliminate them? Okay, so the natural curiosity of the child develops into more disciplined inquiry, which develops into general laws and evaluations. And those questions raise further questions even more general than that. Okay? So where does philosophy come in? Well, I tricked you. Because that last level of questions that I call just more general questions are what we call philosophical questions. What is the nature of man? How does he fit into the world? How should he live his life? How does he know what he knows? And what is basically real? Philosophy ought not to intimidate people, because everybody does philosophy. It's just that not everybody has either the stamina or interest or maybe, ability to do it really well. Eventually, we face the fundamental questions which are at the very heart of our thinking, at the very center of our thinking. Those questions that control what we will consider to be real, how we know what we know, and how we should live our lives. And in answering those questions, we are not only trying to be critical and analytical so that we have a reliable foundation for what we believe and what we do, but we're also seeking an overall or general unity among the fragmented items of what we know. That is, we're looking for what might be called an integration point, or a picture by which we can put everything in our experience in its place. And when we have that picture, that integrating point in our thinking, that helps us to evaluate everything else we do, to interpret the experiences that we have, and to apply what we have learned to the world. So this orientation, this integration point, might be called your worldview. Let me give you a definition of a worldview. A worldview is a network of presuppositions that are not verified by natural science, but in terms of which every aspect of experience is interrelated and interpreted. A worldview is a network of presuppositions not verified by natural science, but in terms of which every aspect of experience is interrelated and interpreted. When we talk about a person's worldview, we're talking about his or her most basic beliefs. Most basic beliefs. Those which are most foundational, or if you want to use a different image, more central to the web of all the other things that they believe. So that's why in my defining of a worldview, I use this word presupposition, that which is pre all my suppositions. All my opinions and thinking have something which goes before them and is prior to them, is the lowest foundational level or in the center of everything, my presuppositions. In my definition, I have said that there is a network of presuppositions. Let's reflect on that for a moment. People don't have just one opinion at the center of their life. The first reason why that's the case, we're going to come back to this later, the first reason is because it's impossible to believe just one thing. Ever think about that? If you were to carry out this observation, reflect on it, it would revolutionize your approach to apologetics. It is impossible to believe only one thing. Try it. Let's see if we can do an experiment in believing just one thing. Let's see if we can just believe that elephants are heavy. Okay? Can you believe only that elephants are heavy? No, because you need to know what an elephant is, right? You also need to know how the English word elephant is used. And that means you have to rely on your memory and previous experiences, and you have to believe that those are reliable. I mean, if I were right now to say, I don't know how I could actually be just this radical in my skepticism, but if right now I were to say, I don't think any English word I've ever learned has been learned properly. If I were just totally say, I can't speak English, I'm not sure of English. Of course, then I couldn't use the English sentence to say, I'm not sure about English, right? Can I completely eradicate all my memories of the use of the English language, the many times that I've said, you know, please open the door, and somebody did what I thought was the right response and opened the door and so? Can I put all that aside? Elephants are heavy. It requires me to rely on my understanding of the English language and my understanding of elephants. For my understanding of elephants, what does it require? You know, some knowledge about zoos, maybe, or maybe more sophisticated knowledge of the animal world and mammals and, you know, the place of elephants in it. So I also have to understand the use of the word heavy and the concept of heavy. And to do that, I can't just think about elephants. Because remember, we're supposed to only believe one thing. So elephants are heavy requires me to think about something more than elephants to understand elephants. And to understand heavy, I have to understand more than just elephants. So it turns out it's impossible to believe just one thing. Every belief we have is tied into some other beliefs that we have. Or as I like to put it in my popular seminars, beliefs come in clusters. They aren't marbles. All of our beliefs are clustered. And one belief supports another belief with various kinds of relationships of meaning and evidential support and application. All of our beliefs are clustered. Nevertheless, there are some beliefs which are more basic than other beliefs. Though it's going to be a cluster of beliefs, not all beliefs are held with the same degree of tenacity. Okay? Let me tell you a couple of things that I believe. I believe that you can't have a plum that's as big as a pumpkin. It's one of the things I believe. I thought about writing songs about that. I believe for every drop of rain that falls, a flower grows. I believe a plum will never be as big as a pumpkin. Something else I believe is that I have a mother and a father. Now, I believe what I believe about plums, and I believe what I believe about parents. Now, would anybody think that nevertheless those beliefs are on an equal footing in terms of how strongly I hold to them? What would it take to convince me that I'm wrong about plums and pumpkins? Well, it may take a lot, and it may be that it isn't possible, but at least it's easy to understand what would lead me to give that up. Somebody were to work on some genetic distortion in a plum, and he got one that began to approximate a small pumpkin, I'm going to say, wow, I think maybe I'm going to have to reconsider my belief about plums and pumpkins. You can imagine me giving up that belief under some circumstances, right? Now, would it be just that easy to have me give up the belief that I have a mother and a father? Now, I'm not saying to give up the belief that the person I call, or the people I call mom and dad, are in fact my mom and dad. That'd be strange, and it'd be hard to do, but I can imagine circumstances under which I would say, wow, I was adopted, no one ever told me. So these aren't really my mother and father. But I wouldn't draw the conclusion I don't have a mother and I don't have a father. Believing that you have parents, that's something that we believe, is something that's far more basic, if you will, than what we believe about the characteristics of the natural world, plums and pumpkins. So everybody has beliefs. These beliefs come in clusters, and some of those clusters are more authoritative, more tenaciously held onto than others. So there are more basic beliefs. Now, the most basic beliefs we have, those beliefs which are prior to all of our other suppositions, we call our presuppositions. And our presuppositions come in clusters. I've already explained that to you. So in my definition, I say a worldview is a network of presuppositions, plural. By calling it a network, I'm recognizing that clustering effect. But I'm doing more than saying that it's a cluster, because as you know, a cluster of grapes need not be ordered in any particular way. Or whatever order we do see, we don't necessarily think it's special or significant in itself. But the cluster of presuppositions that a person holds is networked. That is to say, they are adjusted to each other. They aren't just arbitrarily thrown together. Today, at some point, I'm going to be talking to you about worldview types and various orientations. And you'll see that a certain view of reality never goes with a different view, which is conflicting in character, of epistemology. There are only certain kinds of views of reality that fit in with a particular view of knowledge, and vice versa. And so whenever somebody holds to, well, let's say, the idea that everything we know is based on a particular sensation, you'll find out that that person never holds to a worldview that says there are general things, what are known as universals, that exist. People who have the approach that we can only know our particular sensations never draw the conclusion, nevertheless, there are universal realities. Epistemology and metaphysics go hand in hand, as I've kind of warned you in previous lectures in this course already. So there's a networking effect among our basic cluster of beliefs, our presuppositions. Everybody with me so far? You nod your heads. I told you didn't have to be worried about this.
Please turn the cassette over at this time.
Okay, so a worldview is a network of presuppositions. What do the presuppositions address? Well, three questions that are really the outline or the divisions of what we call philosophy. Your presuppositions will address the nature of reality. In philosophy, that's called metaphysics, questions about the nature of reality. Your presuppositions will address how you know what you know, your theory of knowledge. Theory of knowledge is epistemology. And then your presuppositions will also address the most fundamental question about what's right and wrong, how we should conduct ourselves, or your ethics. So metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Not all of our metaphysical, epistemological, or ethical opinions are at the presuppositional level. I'm not saying that. I am saying, however, that everybody's got a basic cluster of beliefs about reality, knowing, and living. Everybody's got that. And then they develop higher levels and other convictions based on more fundamental convictions. They build out from that. But at the center of everybody's set of beliefs is a network of presuppositions. Now, the next thing in the definition that you want to notice is that these presuppositions are not verified by natural science. And that's going to bother some people right away. People who say everything we know we have to know on the basis of natural scientific, technique, are going to say, well, then we don't have any of these presuppositions because we can only know the things that we know by natural science. So I realize there are a lot of people in the world who say that, but there are a lot of people who aren't very intelligent in what they say too. So the fact that a lot of people are saying it shouldn't automatically worry you. Anybody who says everything we believe on the basis of natural science needs to be asked at least one more question, right? And is what you just said something we learned by natural science? You see, natural science can't answer all questions because it can't answer questions about itself. And there may be other defects in that point of view as well, which we'll come to, but the reason why natural science does not verify our presuppositions is because it's our presuppositions that guide our use of natural science. What if your presupposition is the physical world is Maya and is nothing but chaos, and any semblance of order has been imposed by the illusory imagination of my mind? That's pretty radical. But if you believe that, you're obviously not going to spend a whole lot of time in the science lab trying to find, a cure for polio, are you? Because what you're studying in the lab, there's nothing to study there. It's all illusion, and whatever you find, you've spun out of your own imagination anyway. So you wouldn't bother to do that. Now, when I use that kind of radical illustration, some people will say, oh yeah, but so what? You can't find people like that. Oh yeah? Have you ever been in the eastern part of the world? There are a lot of people who don't trust our experience that comes through sensation and observation. A lot. We got to deal with those people too. We can't just say, oh no, we're only going to have a theory of knowledge that talks to people on our block. People who are in our culture, people who are like us. If you're going to be philosophical, you have to entertain some radical alternatives. And it turns out that natural science itself rests upon certain presuppositions, doesn't it? certain presuppositions about the reality of the physical world, about the regularity of events in the physical world, about the reliability of my sensing organisms, about the reliability of my memory, the appropriateness of applying my logical theories to the world in which I live, and on and on and on. Now, all I'm trying to point out here is that a person's presuppositions in the nature of the case could not be a matter that's verified by natural science, because natural science has its own presuppositions. Okay? Well, they aren't verified by natural science, which itself depends on presuppositions. Then our most basic presuppositions are held by faith, aren't they? Everybody's got a basic faith. I quickly add, for the sake of those who've been misled on the use of the word faith, that faith doesn't mean a blind leap. All I'm saying is it's not based on observation. But there are a lot of things that we believe that aren't based on observation, right? Sometimes we believe in the loyalty of a friend, even though what we have observed would seem to stand against it. And what's that based on? Well, that's a faith commitment about the character of the person. And even though there's contrary evidence, or apparently contrary evidence, you continue to believe that. We believe that the toothpaste is going to squirt out of the tube tomorrow morning when we squeeze the tube. And we say, well, but we have seen that. We've seen it in the past. But what we haven't seen is that the future and the past are connected, to use a figure of speech, that what happens in the future is going to be what's like our experience, that it's like our experience in the past. We don't see that. All of us have things that we believe without direct eyeball inspection, whether it's about interpersonal relationships or the operation of the natural world, or that we're the same person that was in that second grade elementary school picture. I mean, we didn't watch ourselves from the day of that picture every moment to make sure there was no change of personality. We, by faith, assume a certain idea about human continuity. That was me when I was younger. Anyway, the presuppositions that we hold are held by faith, but that isn't to say that there's some kind of arbitrary, willy-nilly leap. Like, I'll just believe anything. That's what some people think faith is. Faith is just, having this commitment to whatever you want to be committed to, regardless of the evidence. So as long as you don't interpret the word faith in that way, then what I'm saying here is that a worldview is a network of presuppositions held on faith. And by the way, not only is it held on faith, those presuppositions are held religiously. Okay, now we have to understand religion, right? I gave us a little caveat about faith a moment ago. Let me say something about religion. Most people make the mistake of automatically thinking of ritual when they hear the word religion. Maybe that's not the best word, but they think of worship or synagogue, church, building, going through certain actions, certain kind of somber tones of voice or something. Religion has to do with engaging in a certain kind of ritual. And so then we think people who don't go through these kinds of somber rituals in some kind of personal, some group or individual setting are not religious. But I think that is an impoverished view of religion. Religion has to do with our ultimate commitments, what we're willing to live for and die for. Although not everybody is true to their religion, but they act like this is what I would die for, this is what I'm living for. Everybody has some kind of ultimate commitment. Even if they don't have a liturgy for their ultimate commitment, they've got an ultimate commitment. And their ultimate commitment helps systematize their experience. Their ultimate commitment gives meaning to their life. What are we here for? What should I live for? What should be my purpose? Tells me how to live my life and how to evaluate other things, how to assess what's valuable. And those ultimate commitments don't turn out to be beliefs about whether there's a train outside right now. I believe that there's a train outside. At least there was. Rarely hear it now. So that was one of my beliefs. Did you have that belief when you heard that train? Oh, and there's somebody else out there too. Yeah, you do have these beliefs. But you know, because I didn't draw attention to that, you listened to that train, you had that belief, and probably, if I had waited another 5 minutes and asked the question, you might not even have been able to remember if there's a train outside. Sometimes our beliefs are so temporary, they're only a few seconds long. Isn't that incredible? Other beliefs we hold on to, and in fact we don't want to let go of. They are so central, we are so committed to them, that to give them up would require a major disruption in our thinking or our living. A major disruption. And that's because, to use the figure of a spider web, they're so central to the web that you break those beliefs and the whole web goes whack. You know, it's just going to mess up your entire life. Now, from what you've learned of human experience, are people generally inclined to allow for their entire lives to be totally disrupted day by day by day by day? I kind of like that, right? You know, like all my relationships to all other people are going to be fundamentally changed today and tomorrow and the next day. And the way in which I see the world and what's real and how I know what I know, well, I'll tell you, who knows what I'll be thinking on Saturday when that rolls around. Nobody likes to do that. It's uncomfortable. It's not only uncomfortable, it's entirely inconvenient. Because now we got to reorganize everything. How many people do you know who go home every day and open all the drawers in their dresser and throw everything out on the floor, pull everything out of their closets and say, let's reorganize? Well, it's probably good to do that occasionally. But once you've done it, what do? You usually sit down and go, man, I've got that done. I've got years ahead of me before I'm going to change the organization of this house. People don't like to reorganize. They don't like things to be all in upheaval. That's true mentally and intellectually too. And so the most fundamental convictions that we have about life, those things which are our ultimate commitment, we don't like to see them tossed up and down and shaken and so forth and then having to reorganize. And so people hold on to them. Sometimes they hold on to them because they're scared to change their point of view. They don't know what will happen if I give up these things that have helped me organize my life, helped me understand things. And sometimes they're lazy, intellectually lazy. It's easier to say to the preacher who is really pushing me hard about my sin and coming under the judgment of God, it's easier to say, I don't have time for this, than to now have the next few days totally disrupted by wondering, what if I were to die and I have to face God? Am I right? Don't people do this? People are lazy when it comes to their religion. People are scared. And so philosophically, that cluster of beliefs, which is networked together, that's at the center of the web of our lives, by which we understand what is real and how we know what we know and how we should live our lives, that cluster is held religiously, tenaciously. It gives meaning to us, and we know we can't negotiate those beliefs without a major disruption, and most of us don't like to reorganize the closet. Boy, what a handful of mixed metaphors. But you all understand what I'm saying here? Okay, so a worldview is a network of presuppositions, and it's not verified by the process of natural science. They're presuppositions held by faith and held religiously. There may not be a liturgy, may not be ritual that goes along with it. There may be. You know, if you're a Hindu at your most basic level, you may go through Hindu rituals, but the ritual is not what defines the worldview. It's the worldview that defines the ritual. So let's just get that straight. Everybody's got a network of basic beliefs, presuppositions, not verified by natural science, and it's in terms of that network of beliefs that every aspect of our experience will now be interrelated and interpreted. How do I tie the various parts of my life together? Your worldview is going to help you do that. All right, so you're a university student, and in the morning you go to the psychology class, and there you learn certain things about human nature. Let's say you're in a behavioristic psychology class. The man has put a white rat. Maybe not white, but nevertheless it's a rat. and he's been programmed, he's been stimulated in a certain way that he responds now to the stimulus, and it's almost predictable. If you just knew all the factors, you could actually get people to do what you wanted them. So you learn that in the morning, and then in the afternoon you take a poli-sci class, and here the poli-sci instructor is calling for us to rise up against our authoritarian masters who are oppressing us and to gain human freedom so we can finally realize the dignity of every human being. Your worldview is going to be called into play now. You can say, how do I relate what I learned in psychology to what I'm learning in political science? Your worldview helps you relate all these things. And that's a high level. I gave you an example of high level beliefs about the nature of man as free or as programmed and determined. But our worldview helps us relate all of our day-to-day mundane affairs too. Like how much money I have in my pocket and whether I can buy a loaf of bread at the store. It's conceivable to have a worldview that says, well, those aren't related. Why not? Well, because I take what I want. I don't buy it anyway. So you didn't even think about that option, did you? Because you're all Christians. Your worldview said, well, of course, if you don't have the money, you can't buy the bread. But you see, there are some people who really don't draw that connection. In fact, they laugh at people who do. They say, what an unusual way of living. Might makes right. I just take it. And because other people have that strange view, they're going to try to, capture me and punish me if I do it. So I have to kind of get along in this world with the people that have that strange. That isn't my belief. Your worldview helps you integrate and interpret everything that happens to you. To interpret everything that happens to you. You wake up in the middle of the night and you realize that the reason that you have awakened is because there was a noise. And it's not as though you're now hearing the noise, but have you ever had that experience where it's almost like it's trailing off? It's like, I was just hearing something, and that's why I've been awakened. For some of us, embarrassingly, it was my snoring that I was hearing, and that's what awakened me. Okay, you wake up and you say, what was, I don't know, it was me. But you wake up in the middle of the night, and let's say it's not so easy, that you're snoring, and say, what was that noise? How should I interpret what's happened to me? Maybe there are ghosts in the house. Why do some people worry about that and other people don't? To be very honest with you, and I'm not being macho man here, I never worry about ghosts being in my house. There was a time when I did. Now, I didn't worry a lot, but there was a time when I would entertain that question when I was a child, but I don't now. Why? Because my worldview precludes that hypothesis. Since I don't believe in ghosts, I don't worry about ghosts. I don't even, it's not like I said, okay, now, here's the full range of possibilities. Let's start, checking them off. Go do the ghost test. No, not a ghost. I don't even worry about that one. It's not even on the list, Maybe someone's broken into the house, maybe one of my children's sick, so forth. Those are realistic given my worldview. But I interpret my experience on the basis of what my worldview tells me are the possibilities. Right? Why is it that when you give evidence to somebody of the resurrection of Jesus Christ as a historical fact, they can accept that and say, I'm not a supernaturalist, though. It's because their worldview is naturalistic. So they'll say, well, okay, if that happened, it happened in some natural way, and we don't know what the factors are. We can't explain it right now, but I'm not going to move from that to the conclusion God's been active in history, because I don't believe in God. The interpretation of your experience is governed by your worldview. Okay. I trust everybody's with me now. Worldview is defined as a network of presuppositions not verified by natural science, in terms of which every aspect of experience is interrelated and interpreted. Everybody has one. It's inevitable. That process of philosophical development is inevitable. I didn't say it was inevitable that you become a good philosopher, a self-conscious philosopher, a sophisticated philosopher, but everyone does philosophy because everybody's got a worldview. Now, I'm anticipating where I'm going in the course. I'm not going to develop this right now, but I just want to ask you this question. Do you think it's possible for people in the inevitable process of developing a worldview to have discordant elements in their worldview? Is there anything automatic about people being utterly rational and consistent? Have you ever known people to be inconsistent? Okay, keep that in mind. I say everybody has a worldview. I have not taught you everybody has a rational and consistent one, but everyone has one. Held by faith, held religiously. For those of you who have not studied philosophy, either on your own or as majors in college or whatever, I'd like to give you a list of key philosophical questions now. Within everyone's worldview, there are basic or key philosophical questions that are going to come up. And I'm going to divide, I'm going to do this in two ways. The first set of questions I give you is going to be divided into the three basic categories of philosophy: metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. And so everybody is going to ask questions or have some kind of basic understanding with respect to the nature of reality, metaphysics. What's the nature of man? What is the nature of man? Everybody's got to have some view of that. Is man an animal? Is man good? Is man bad? Is man free? Secondly, everyone has a view of the nature of the universe. Where did it come from? Everybody's got a view of that. Sometimes you hear people say, I take no stand on origins. The reason I chuckle is because you can't help but have some operating idea of what this world is. Was it always here? Now, there are people, I think, who act as though it was always here. I think that's a silly position to hold, but there are people who act that way. And there are some people who act as though it wasn't always here. There are some who think it came just boingo from chance, and others who think there was an intelligent, personal God who created it. There are only so many views, but everybody's operating on some view. What's the nature of the universe in which we live? And then what's man's place in the universe, right? What is man? What is the universe? And what's man's place there? The prevailing view in our culture, by the way, is that man is an insignificant speck in the impersonal, machine-like running of the universe. You know, I'm not talking about precise theoretical views that would be stated in this way, but most people have this idea, I'm just an insignificant, I'm just like a leaf floating through, you know, the air. I'm just something in this universe that is too insignificant. I don't make much of a difference. I'm subject to the universe. That's why the Christian view that you really rise above the universe, being closer to God than to the animals, and that what you do has so much significance that it will last for all eternity, just blows people's minds. No. I'm just the evolutionary outcropping of an original slime, a puddle one day started developing. Again, these are not intellectually precise points of view, but in terms of the general feeling people have, they have a view of man, and they have a view of the universe and man's place in the universe. The existence of God is a metaphysical question. Does God exist? What's God like? What does God do? What does God care about? Does God care about anything? Metaphysics asks questions about the nature of change and development. And when you push, what is the nature of history? Why do things change? How do things develop? Is development design, or is it random? If it's random, is it development? Why do things change? How do things change? Is it even possible for things to change? Okay, a little caveat, because I see these smirks on your faces. A lot of people think philosophers waste time asking irrelevant questions, like, why do things change and how do things change? We all know things change. Oh, do you? You know that things change? The philosopher Leslie
somebody's so cocksure that they start saying, we can take that for granted. Really? And so we go back to the ancient Greeks, and Zeno in particular. Zeno of Elea said, well, if you're so sure that things changed, maybe you could explain something to me. And then he would tell stories like the flight of the arrow and just say, now, if you know that things change, then you should be able to answer these questions about change. And then people get all tied up in knots, and it turns out they ultimately say, I can't explain to you change, but I experience it. He says, oh, well, you see, now we're back to the original problem. Do we know that things change if it's an experience that we can't make rational? Philosophers seem to waste a lot of time on questions like that don't help you earn a paycheck and raise your children, it seems like. And so many people want to dismiss philosophy. The reason why philosophers ask this question, can we go back to the original just for a moment, is because that natural curiosity with which we all begin in life has developed into a systematic inquiry, a disciplined inquiry, and has led to general laws and so forth about which we have to ask questions. Philosophy by nature is at the abstract end of things. We know that. But the reason why philosophers ask these abstract questions is because we've been led into some kind of conundrum. Is man free or is man determined? Much of our experience would tell us everything in this world is predictable and therefore is determined. But if man is part of this world, and he certainly is, he's got a physical body, he walks through this world, he seems to be part of this world, then it would seem that man is determined. And yet we also feel the need to punish people who do what we think is quote-unquote wrong, immoral. There's ought in our thinking as well. So the philosopher says, well, how do you take those two things and bring them together? That's at the abstract end, okay? When you're getting ready to cook dinner for your family, you're not too concerned about whether motion is real. But there are problems in our lives, in our thinking, that lead to one kind of conclusion, and different problems and needs that lead to another conclusion, and it's the philosopher who has to sit back in the armchair and go, should we say that motion is an illusion, and that what we rationally can put together is what's real? Or should we say that our reason is not adequate to this, and our experience of motion is what we should count on anyway? That's a very fundamental question. So anyway, when I give you some of these abstract questions that everybody's got to answer in their worldview, again, I realize they don't ask the question explicitly, but everybody's got some approach to these things, and it's the philosopher who abstracts and says, let's now address this. What should we do with this? What's the nature of change, development, and history? Another metaphysical question is, what's the character of laws? What's the character of concepts? What's the character of universals? What's the nature of uniformity in our experience? The character of laws. I'm not asking what the laws are. That would be an epistemological or an ethical question. Okay, so we have laws of logic, we have laws of morality, but the metaphysical question is, what is a law? What is, not what are the laws in terms of their character, but when we talk about a law, what kind of thing are we talking about? Does it taste like chocolate? Is it that kind of thing? No. Oh, is it kind of like a dream then? No, it's not that kind of thing. What is a law? That's a metaphysical question. In light of the summary of questions that I've given you so far, I wonder if you can see as a Christian that we have a specific metaphysic. What's the nature of man? Is he good or is he bad? Well, we have a story about creation and fall, don't we? Where did this universe come from? Doctrine of creation. What is the nature of change and development? The doctrine of providence. Where is everything going? What's history all about? Doctrine of the consummation. Earlier I told you that as I see it, philosophy and theology are addressing the same basic questions, but just in different vocabulary, approaching it differently, but they're the same issues. We have a Christian philosophy, therefore, inherent in our Christian theology. If you read the opening chapters of Van Til's The Defense of the Faith, that's what he's trying to get across. He's trying to express the Christian worldview. And so he looks at the Christian view of reality and the Christian view of knowledge and the Christian view of behavior. He's just addressing the philosophy categories, the subdivisions of philosophy. And he says, this is what our theology would tell us. So let me give you your theology in the language of the philosopher.
This message is continued on the next tape. This message is a continuation of the previous tape.
Let's move ahead. We've looked at metaphysical questions, epistemological questions that are part of everybody's worldview. What is the nature of truth? And what is the nature of objectivity? Is all truth subjective truth? Something that's part of the subject, part of the subject's desires or way of seeing? Or is truth something that's public and outside the subject, and therefore true for everybody? Another epistemological question is, what's the nature of belief? What is it to believe something? And then, what is it to know something rather than to just believe it? What's the difference between belief and knowledge? One of the key epistemological questions is, what are our standards for justifying beliefs? And what procedure should we follow to justify them? What are our standards and our procedures for justifying beliefs? Epistemology deals with science, the nature of science, and discovery. And once again, it should be obvious that as Christians, our theology gives us some kind of epistemology, doesn't it? Because our theology is based upon and speaks of a doctrine of revelation, how God discloses himself, and how he discloses himself in our experience, in our minds, in history, in his word, in his Son. There's a revelational epistemology in the Bible. And then let's turn to ethics. In philosophy, every worldview has a particular approach to ethics. It may not be consistent, it may not be well thought out, but everybody has some basic idea of the nature of good and evil. And if I can, again, speculate for a moment, I'd say in our culture, all of us have some notion that good is that which is fair to everybody. Maybe it is the case that good is fair to everybody, and maybe it isn't the case, but that is a pervasive cultural zeitgeist right now. Zeitgeist, spirit of the age. Okay? And our way of looking at things, our pervasive mindset as a culture, says that good is what's fair to everybody. Well, if you don't hold that, well, it's more than just that, but that and other things are embraced in what I'm getting at when we say there's a fundamental view of the nature of good and evil. Our ethic involves a standard of morality. It involves a view of guilt, atonement, and personal peace. And everybody's got to have some view of that, because everybody deals with guilt. And everybody has to have some notion of personal peace, its value, and how it's achieved. It would be a fascinating study, maybe a nice Sunday school class for you sometime, just to go through the various views of personal peace in our world today. What is the nature of personal peace, and how do we gain it? Does personal peace come when I get the most toys, and I'm on top of the heap, and I can set myself apart from everybody else? Does personal peace come when I'm at one with everybody? Well, those are radically different views of personal peace, aren't they? And how do you gain personal peace if you feel guilty? A lot of people take drugs. Some people take drugs, obviously, for the thrill of it. Some people take drugs because they want to be dulled. Anyway, everyone has some view of personal peace, atonement, and guilt. And more generally, everyone has some view of social order. how we should relate to one another in society. What's the nature of society? And then taking it a step further, how should authority be exercised in society? What's the nature of the state? Our ethical outlook involves questions about how we attain and how we produce moral character. Okay, so if you're not a patient person, how should you attain patience? How can you produce a better moral character in yourself? Well, these ethical questions obviously bear on all sorts of things that we as Christians believe theologically, about the fall, right? About the nature of God and His holiness, and about redemption. So, everyone has a worldview, and everyone's worldview, not necessarily in a rational, consistent, and well thought out way, but everyone's worldview addresses the nature of the real. What's this world like? What's man like? What's God like? What's real? The nature of knowledge, how we know what we know, and everyone's worldview addresses how we should live our lives. Metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Now, I said I wanted to do this 2 times. I'm going to run past it twice. That's an attempt to organize things according to category. Now I'm going to give you a list of philosophical questions that has historically developed. In fact, I'm going back to the origins of philosophy in the Greek world and give you a summary of the sorts of things that originally philosophers were mystified by and they argued over. And there's a method to this madness, because I want you to see that the questions that I'm giving you from the very beginning days of philosophy turn out to be the very questions that we're struggling with today. Which leads some people to say, philosophy, what a waste of time. These guys don't make any progress. Well, these are the enduring, if not endearing, enduring questions of human life. Some people go home and they just want a beer and turn on the TV, but to one degree or another, everybody is going to ask philosophical questions. And if you think systematically and long about them, you'll find that those who are reputed to be the philosophers have pretty much caught on to what are the central issues. I mean, I can make fun of philosophers as well as any lawyer can make fun of lawyers. But in the end, the reason I've given a good portion of my life studying is because I really think it's important. Philosophers can act like real jackasses, no doubt about it. But what they're working with is critical. And so you should have some respect for the enduring questions. Why are they still there? What is philosophy? Philosophy is the desire to find explanations. How do things happen? Why do things happen? The baby in the crib is a very, 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 very low-level philosopher. The child going to elementary school is a little bit more of a philosopher. The child learning about science, the child going to college, organizing things in a disciplined way, these explanations are developing. But ultimately, the most abstract and general questions about how we know, what the nature of reality is, and so forth, those are the philosophical questions. And so philosophy began many, many, many years ago with the desire to find explanations. How do we justify those explanations? Now, I explain this happened because of that. This event was caused by that. What are the methods or the standards by which I justify that comment? What method should I use? What standard should I use to justify my explanations? And then, in this desire to find explanations, how do I resolve internal conflict in my explanations? How do I resolve internal conflicts in my explanations? I'll stick with the illustrations I've already used. Hopefully they sink in. Why is it I say man is a physical entity, part of the physical world, but my explanation of man's behavior is not governed by the same laws by which I explain an apple falling from a tree? Why do I explain man's behavior by reference to creativity and freedom and responsibility, but I explain other things in the physical world in terms of the laws of physics, chemistry, biology, and what have you? The philosopher desires to find explanations, but explanations that are, one, justified, and two, the internal conflicts have been resolved. The early Greeks struggled with that. Next question. How are we to understand nature? How are we to understand matter in motion? What is the stuff of which the world is made? I know that sounds funny to put it that way, but I don't think there's any more basic way of saying it. What is the world made of? What is this stuff? And how is it possible that it changes? Is there one basic stuff of which everything is made? Say they said yes. If there wasn't one basic stuff, we wouldn't have an ultimately rational explanation for the world. And so everything's got to basically do the same thing. Water. But then the problem is, well, if everything's water, why do some things look different than other things? Why do some things seem more like water than other things? And so now he has to have an explanation of change, right? How the one becomes a many. How does the central stuff, the one rational unifying factor of reality, become the diverse things that we experience in our day-to-day lives? Why is there sand? Why are there rocks? Why are there plums and pumpkins if everything's water? Other people come along and say, well, your explanation of change isn't really helpful. Maybe this world's not made up of the same basic one kind of thing, the one stuff. Maybe it's made up of four kinds of things. Maybe it's earth, air, fire, and water. Well, you know, that really improves the richness and the ability to provide explanations. Now you've got four factors that you can use. But of course, that has been purchased at quite a price. And the price is, how do you unify the four? Now the world seems to be all diverse. And so then someone says, oh, how about this? Why don't we say, instead of four factors that are all different in character, that the world's made up of things that are all the same character, but there's an infinite number of them? We'll call them atoms, those things of which there is no smaller. They're the undivided. They're the indivisible or uncuttable elements. But the atoms are not made up of different qualities. They all have the same quality. And so we have now a rational unity. Everything is the same quality, but we also have room for motion and change because there's an infinite number of them that can be repackaged and reorganized. Well, that seems like an improvement until you say, well, then how do you get a rational understanding of how things change? And then there are those who say, well, all the atoms fall through space and they don't ever change. Everything is determined, in which case our experience of freedom is what? An illusion. And then you have those who are unwilling to give up the illusion of freedom as being an illusion, that is, unwilling to give up freedom as an illusion. And they say, well, then we must have some account for how the atoms have that kind of creativity. There must have been a swerve in the fall of the atoms. But now that raises another question. If one of the atoms swerves so that it now creates all this billiard ball effect of the atoms impinging on one another, why did that one swerve? And if you don't have any explanation of that, then it's irrational. It has no reason. It's irrational. Which means human freedom is what? Irrational. So now you have in your worldview the rational, atoms falling through space, and the irrational, the atoms that are bumping up against one another, which account for our making choices and being creative. Well, I'm not going to go through the whole history of Greek philosophy for you, but you see, when you ask, what is nature? What is this world in which we live? You have to come up with simultaneously an answer for what matter is, what is the stuff, what is the thing or things of which the world is made, And then how is change possible among those things? But the minute you answer the question how change is possible, you have to also have an answer for how there's identity through change. What if everything's changing all the time? If everything's changing all the time, could I utter the sentence, everything's changing all the time? Now, in the first place, when I say everything is changing all the time, I have some concept of enduring identity through the changes. And I say that thing changed. Okay? That thing that was a baby in the crib turned into a 16-year-old driving the family car. It changed. Well, I said it changed, but in the process of saying it changed, I also said it didn't change. Because it's the same thing. The same thing under two different qualities or characteristics. And so now, how is their identity through change? This is getting pretty heavy. What is the relation between the underlying stuff of the world, whatever you say nature is made of, and how change is possible, and how there's identity through change? What is the relation between whatever that is and the way things appear to me? Now we have a tough question of putting together how things are, in fact, what Kant would call the thing in itself, and how it appears to me, the phenomena of my experience. Parmenides had, from a certain point of view, a pretty good philosophical handle on these things. He gave us a nice, rounded-out theory. Only one problem is it called for us to deny the reality of our experience. Parmenides said, well, all is one and there is no change. That settles all the philosophical questions. Boy, put them to bed. But then again, as I walk through this world and have lunch today, I have to be telling myself at all times, this is illusion, this is illusion, there is no change. I'm not different from the burrito that I'm eating. Well, that's a high price to pay, isn't it? So then Heraclitus took the opposite approach. He said, well, then everything's changing. Parmenides, you were wrong. It's not that everything is one and unchanging. Everything's always changing. You can't step in the same river twice. Why? Because the minute you pull your foot out, or the second that you pull your foot out and put it back in, the river has changed. Everything's always changing. All is flux. But then Parmenides had to say, and therefore don't trust, then Heraclitus said, those of you who haven't had the history of philosophy, this is going to confuse you, I'm sorry. Parmenides said, nothing changes, so don't trust your senses. Heraclitus comes along and says, everything changes. And he concludes, so don't trust your senses. Because your senses would tell you what? This desk is not changing. It's been the very same desk since I started the lecture today. Now, if you have some advanced knowledge of biology, you might be willing to say, in a theoretical sense, well, Dr. Bonson has changed. I mean, there are molecular changes in his body since he began the lecture. But generally, when we look at the world, we don't see everything changing all the time. We rely on permanence. You know, when you get ready to go home today, I don't think many of you are going to worry too much about, well, I wonder if my house is in the same place. I wonder if there is even a house anymore. I wonder if this car will stay a car while I'm trying to go home. Here's Heraclitus saying, everything's in flux, everything's changing, but he says, now granted, it doesn't look like that, so don't trust your senses. Isn't that great? Opposite views of reality, they both lead to what? You can't count on what you see. And then other people say, forget these philosophers. Our philosophy should be based on what we see. And so that raises the next basic question in philosophy. This is number 3 in my outline. Is reason an instrument for obtaining objective knowledge of reality? Is reason an instrument for obtaining objective knowledge of reality? Or do we just have to throw up our hands and say, we can't know? Can't know anything for sure. That's what some people say. Can't ever know. I only want to ask one thing of those people who say you can't know anything. Can you know that you can't know anything? I feel like it'd be good when lunch rolls around so I can get away from you for a while, because I can see the fire in your eyes. Philosophers infuriate people. You know why? Because they cross-examine opinions, and they say, you can't be comfortable right there. You can't really take that for granted. And then people try to adjust what they believe so it becomes a little more rational, and then they get attacked from this side. Like there's always something, right? And people begin to feel, I'm damned if I do, damned if I don't, so I give up. Is reason an instrument for obtaining objective knowledge of reality? You say no, and I ask, did reason lead you to that conclusion? If it didn't, then don't we want to say it's unreasonable to say this? Is the knowledge that we gain using the instrument of our senses objective? The great crisis that was introduced in the history of Western thought after Kant was just this. It may be that my mind organizes the sensations in a particular way, in a uniform way, but since my mind is working on these sensations, I can never know that what I think I see is the way it really is. Because my mind is creatively, not interfering, but it's being involved in the process of forming my thoughts and perceptions. And so sensation comes in, but my mind works on it before I really have any phenomena, any experience of it. And so what I experience has nothing to do with ultimate reality, the way things really are. And so he gained rational order, Kant did, at the cost of what? Objectivity. Now the order that we have, which is rational, is subjective in nature rather than being based on the rational order that's really in the world out there. So is reason an instrument for obtaining objective knowledge of reality? And if it is, what approach should we take? The look and see approach or the stop and reflect approach? I'm trying to make this easy for you. Anybody in the philosophy department would say, why are you giving it to them that way? Why don't you tell them what that is? Okay. Do you take the empirical approach, look and see, or do you take the rational approach, stop and reflect? Thales took the look and see approach. Thales said all is water. Now, how did he come up with that? It's not because he was sitting back in his armchair speculating. It's because he was out in the world and said, if there's one thing that has to unify everything, a good candidate would be what there's a lot of. By the way, he was an Ionian philosopher. He's on one of the Greek islands. And so there was a lot of water in his experience. There's water all around us. And when you get up in the morning, you find what? Dew on the grass, on the flowers. When you cut into things, you find things, like you cut your finger, something like water comes out. I mean, it's red, but there's some kind of fluid there, so maybe it's the development of water. When you cut into an orange, it's juicy. Water comes out of the sky. Now, I don't know. Thales doesn't tell us just exactly what he looked at to come to this, but it would appear reasonable, as a reconstruction of this, that Thales said, if there's one thing that reality is made of, if I look around, if I check my observations, it would appear to be water. Now, the next guy who came along, Anaximander, said, no, it can't be water. And why can't it be water? He said, because there are things which are non-watery in this world. You say, but that's just observation, right? No, he was making a very significant rational point. He said, in fact, anything, any particular quality or thing that I offer in the place of Thales' water is going to be subject to the same refutation. Thales says everything's water, but I look at non-watery things and say, boy, you got quite a task here now to get from what is water to what is not water. But if I were to say something else, let's say fire, but then I'd have the problem that those things which don't look like fire, how do they become like that? How do you get from fire to non-fire? And so Anaximander came up with this conclusion. The basic stuff of reality, I'll give you the English translation, is boundless. It has no characteristic. It has no boundary. Apeiron in Greek. Apeiron. The thing that is boundless is not red or white or blue, cold or hot, solid or liquid, sweet or bitter, and on and on and on. Because it has anything that you say definite, any definite character that you attribute will have its opposite, won't it? And so in order to avoid that problem of the opposite, he said, I'll say it's something that has no opposite. It's the boundless. Now, all I'm getting at here is, how did Anaximander reach his conclusion that reality is made up of the boundless, the stuff which has no definite characteristics? Did he do this by looking and seeing? Anybody, run into a puddle of the boundless lately? Oh, this looks like a good. Can't buy a quart of boundless at the store, can you? In the nature of the case, apeiron had to be a rational construction. Instead of going out and looking for a better candidate than water, Anaximenes did that. Anaximenes said, no, it's not water, it's air. But instead of doing that sort of thing, Anaximander, it's like he was the armchair rational philosopher. He sat back and said, now, what is required if I'm going to have an intellectually adequate answer to this question? And so he took a rational approach rather than an empirical approach. He took the stop and reflect approach rather than the look and see. And so this is one of the enduring questions of philosophy. Should we be empirical or rational in our approach? Is reason an instrument for obtaining objective knowledge of reality? Fourth basic question. Now, there's been a lot of sub-questions here, so I'll review for you. I don't want to confuse you. The first one is, how do we find explanations? How do we justify them and resolve internal conflicts? The desire to find explanations. 2, how do we understand nature? What is man, the world, God, etc.? 3, the one we just looked at, is reason an instrument for obtaining objective knowledge of reality? And now 4, by what kind of values should man live? By what kind of values should man live? Are there, in fact, objective values? The Greeks had to ask that question because if some have proposed that the world is purely natural, if the world is purely natural, then there are no values, right? It's just what happens in nature. And it does you no good to rail against that. Fate is fate. Nature is nature. And whenever you talk about value, you're not gaining that from nature itself as though it's real in and of itself. That's just your imagination imposing value on the world. Is man morally distinct and unique from the animals? Can we treat men like we treat other animals? If not, why not? Should reason control our passions? Some people say, you don't want to start thinking because then you won't enjoy life. Passion should be at the heart of your life. What place should pleasure have in the way that I live? The hedonist said, you should live for pleasure. One school of hedonism said you should live for the most pleasure points you can get. The other said, no, you should live for the higher quality pleasures. That too is a value question, isn't it? Which one's right, which one's wrong? Should we live for moderation, peace of mind, honor, justice? And our culture continues to ask those very same questions. That's fascinating to me. We have people, in university settings, and then we have people who offer their weekend seminars too, who will tell people, you need to get passion back in your life. Turn off your mind. Stop being so type A personality. Stop being so intellectualistic. Get in touch with yourself, right? The ancient Greeks were telling people that. And then you have people who go the other way too. You know what's wrong with your life? You're at loose ends. Get organized, guy. Let me show you how to have a daily planner and have all your phone numbers with you. And isn't that right? We have people going the same way. Is honor more important than pleasure? Is peace of mind more important than justice? The Greeks asked these questions, and we're still trying to answer them. Number 5, let me give you 4 summary questions from the beginning of Greek philosophy down to our own day. 4 summary questions. Number 5 is 4 summary questions. Okay. You must be getting close to lunch. You don't have much of a sense of humor, fellas. Come on. Number 1 is man's mind self-sufficient? When all is said and done throughout history, philosophers have been asking, is man's mind self-sufficient? 2, is there an objective moral order? Is there an objective moral order? 3, is there public truth that's accessible by reason? Is there public truth, objective truth, that's accessible by man's reasoning? And 4, what is man's place in the universe? What is man's dignity? And what is the meaning of his life? That's all one long question. What is man's place in the universe, dignity, and meaning for life?
Please turn the cassette over at this time.
So I did it with the myth. I told you there was a method in my madness. I wanted to tell you what these basic questions of philosophy were at the very opening of Greek philosophy, so that you'd appreciate that they are enduring questions. But now I want to look at them again and say, I want you to notice they're also endearing questions. Because as a Christian, it turns out, I'm the one who, by God's grace, is an answer to these questions. Is man's mind self-sufficient? No. Man's mind is dependent upon God's mind. That's why I believe in Revelation. Is there an objective moral order? Yes, because God exists objectively in his holy character as the order for our living. Is there public truth accessible by reason? Yes, because God created the world and all human beings and their minds and made them capable of understanding the world he made. What is man's place in the universe? He's created a little lower than the angels, right? Created as the image of God. What is his dignity? That is the image of God. What's his problem? That he's violated that dignity and rebelled against God. What's the meaning of life? To get right with God and to glorify him and enjoy him forever. And I said, you've all been doing philosophy. You said, well, those are theological answers, yes, but they're also philosophical answers. The underlying, enduring questions of philosophy should be endearing to the apologists because we're the ones who have the answers. The reason why the Greeks have asked these questions and 20th century philosophers are still struggling is because they refuse to do what? Turn to the grace of God and the gospel. They refuse to affirm our worldview. And so they keep spinning their wheels. They keep going round and round and finding frustration and not being able to resolve these questions. Before we break for lunch, I do want to rehearse for you, since many of you will not have done the study yourself, but rehearse for you, by way of boiling it down, the basic answers or worldview types that are available out there. I do think we'll take a 2-minute break, though.
I totally did. But there was shipping too, to be fair.
Sorry about that.
Yeah,
Now, before our lunch break, let's see if I can outline for you. I think every Christian, you don't have to have this, well, you don't have to have this course to do apologetics, obviously. And you don't have to have an understanding of the various worldview types. But I trust you can see how valuable it would be for you, how practical it would be, if you'd have some idea of what the options are out there that you're going to encounter. A caveat. you are not necessarily going to encounter people who say, oh, well, I'm a monist. They may not even know what the word means. They may not even be able to give you a list of what the options are from which they chose. But you need to know what the various views are, so when you talk to people, you can categorize where they're coming from. And if you know what some of the problems of these worldviews are, when you run into that kind of worldview, you know automatically what kinds of questions you're going to press. So that's why we're doing this. Not because people know the vocabulary, and not because it's absolutely necessary that you have all of these and that, but to make it very practical, I think, a lot more efficient for you to know the questions to address to people if you can identify the category of thought in which to locate them. And this division of worldview types is my own development. I've done this for the sake of simplicity. See, so someone does love it. I told you I was going to stretch you today, but I've tried to simplify this. There are four basic, fundamental types of worldview. Monistic, dualistic, atomistic, and finally, pragmatic. I have purposely mixed metaphysical and epistemological categories here. If you were to do this in a more purist way, if I was in a university setting teaching you a course on this, I would not do it this way. But if you want to have it, just like, something you can hold on to and put in your pocket and pull out and consult and so forth, this will be the easiest way because everyone's going to fall into one of these in one way or another. A monistic worldview is one that says that everything is one. There's no duality, there's no plurality, there's no diversity, everything is one. The Western way of looking at the world finds this boring as well as unconvincing. Because you see, if everything's one, there are no color differences, there's no quality differences. In fact, there's no ethical differences. Hinduism, which is the best example of a monistic worldview, Hinduism says even good and evil are the same ultimately, because everything is God. So as an example of monism, you may want to put in your notes Hinduism. The kind of monism that I'm mentioning here is actually spiritual monism. Spiritual monism. The view that all is one and that one is spirit rather than matter. Now there's a problem, of course, because if all is one, then it can't be spirit or matter, can it? It really should be something that's neither spirit nor matter. But Hinduism holds to a spiritual monism. Now there's another kind of monism that is not spiritual in nature, but rather material in nature. And many people, sadly, today are materialists. Materialism in philosophy doesn't refer to greed. The materialistic outlook. I got to get a better car, a better home, and so forth. Materialism is the view that everything that's real is matter. It's materialistic. But I'm going to consider materialism under atomism for the sake of this simple summary. All right? I want you to see, I told you already, it's not a systematic outline. This is the convenient outline. It's like, this is what you're going to run into. So you have Hinduism, the monist approach of Eastern religions. You also have, at this level, of a material sort, but when we get there, we'll call that atomism. Before we get there, before we get to many kinds of reality, or bits of reality, from the one, there's an intermediate stop that's very important, I believe, but not always paid attention to by Christian philosophers today, and that's dualism. Dualism. The view that there are two types of things that are real. And among the dualists, you will find idealists on the one hand, and Stoics on the other.
Idealism says that ultimate reality is not matter, but is idea, concepts, forms, universals. And Plato, obviously, is the leading illustration of that. Now, if you are an idealist, then you also believe what? That you know things by way, or you know things in a way that goes beyond sensation, that goes beyond observation of your eyes, ears, and so forth. And so idealism is linked in one way or another with some kind of intuitional epistemology. So Plato said, how do we know the forms or ideas? We recollect them from a previous life. We intuit them. It's just part and parcel of what's in us when we are born. And I'm giving you a simple summary. I realize I can't develop this. Time doesn't allow. So under the dualist approach, you're going to find most of what we call rationalism in the history of philosophy. Rationalism is subject to many definitions. Three important definitions, which are quite different from one another, have to be given. So then I'll go back and tell you which one this is. Rationalism sometimes is used for that attitude of autonomy that says, I don't need supernatural revelation. Okay? In that sense, rationalism is secularism. We don't need revelation. Sometimes rationalism is that school of thought, totally apart from the question of whether we need revelation, that says that man's reason should dominate in his personality. That we should be rational in what we are doing. That we're subject to the laws of rationality. That we shouldn't despise intellect and submit to emotion or pure will. Now, just in those first two definitions, you see the difference in that the Christian is not a rationalist if you mean somebody who rejects revelation. The Christian is a rationalist if you mean somebody who believes the intellect is subject to the laws of logic and so forth. So we should use our intellect in a proper way. But then, as a specific school of philosophy in the history of Western thought, rationalism is the view that it's possible to know certain things apart from observation. It's possible to know certain things apart from observation. A good example of the laws of mathematics. There are certain things that we know, but we did not learn them from observation. And that third sense of the word rationalism is what I'm referring to here in my little outline. The idealist approach that says there are ideas and they are the fundamental reality and all of our thinking is to be governed by the laws of ideas or rationality is a form of rationalism. Another dualist approach is that of the Stoics. This is tied with what I'll call a moralistic approach to life. The Stoics taught that there was a logos that flows through the natural world. A logos is a reason. Okay? There's a word or a reason that flows through the natural world and makes it the way it is. And our job is to get in line with the logos. See why early Christian apologists like the Stoics? That sounds like we should get in line with Jesus, the Logos. He's the controller of the world. It's fascinating to draw those connections, but for another day, because it's almost lunchtime. The Stoic approach to life says you've got a natural world out there, but you're supposed to live in a particular way in this natural world. Real easy illustration. The Stoics said, don't fuck it. The way things are going in the world, fit into it. Or as we say in California, go with the flow. Okay? So you're on the BQE, and you've got to make it to, this party, and you're due there at 6:30. It's already 6:20. You got 10 more miles to go, and there are cars all over the place because of accidents. Now, what do? Well, people are different, but I've seen some people drive in Brooklyn, and I can't be get uptight, I want to get in here, get in this one. The Stoic would say, hey, be stoic about this. Take it with indifference. Fall back, realize you're not going to make it on time. That's just the way nature is. Chill out. Now, wouldn't you think that the Roman Empire would love to have soldiers that were stoic? And they were. Stoicism was real popular in the Roman army. Because you see, that fits into the soldier's mentality, right? I can't control everything. It's just my place to submit. Fit in. See, stiff upper lip. Be tough about it. Be stoic, as we say. So the Stoic says, we've got a world out there that's different from us, and yet there are certain ideals by which we should live. This develops into the notion of natural law. We should fit into nature and so forth. But the point is, I should be moralistic. There are moralistic worldviews that say, not only do we have atoms and chemicals or matter and motion out there, but we also should live our lives in a certain way in response to it. We're going to talk about the difficulty of such a worldview when we get to presuppositional apologetics, but again, I'll anticipate it. Stop and think about that. When you talk to people who say, I think matter is what's fundamentally real, but it's wrong to kill people, immediately you're going to say, now, you have to explain to me how you get an immaterial value, don't kill, and there's nothing but matter. How do you bring these together? How do you get matter and immaterial values together in your worldview? Dualism, two types of things. And the basic problem of every dualist system is, how do you get unity between the two types of things? Is one more fundamental than the other? Did the one arise from the other? And then we come to a materialistic worldview, in its more sophisticated form as we know it today, atomism. It's monistic, just like the Hindu, but I'm taking monism in the spiritual sense, or the non-physical sense up here. Materialistic atomism. And among the materialists, by the way, materialism goes hand in hand with the goes hand in hand with the epistemology of empiricism. Empiricism says everything that we know is based on observation. Everything. Not just that we can observe and learn things, but the only things we can learn are based on observation. So you have rationalism here, empiricism here, rationalism tied to idealism and a dualist approach, empiricism tied to atomism or a materialistic approach. But among those that you're going to encounter in this world that are materialistic, there's a fundamental difference of opinion that we have to recognize in our outline. And that is between those who are deterministic and those that are hedonistic.